Lyria never planned to find Earth, and she did not know that this small blue planet would change everything for her and the entire Delayer. Galaxy around them, all her ship was dying in the cold darkness of space after a fight with space pirates who attacked her near the nebula region, and all her systems were failing one by one, and she had no choice but to follow the emergency signals that led her through an unknown pathway. The planet appeared suddenly before her eyes, like a jewel hidden in the darkness. And it was covered in blue oceans and green lands and white clouds that moved slowly across its surface, and she knew she had to land there or die in the void of space. Illyria was Altheri, and her people served the Valorian Empire for 3,000 years as warriors and scouts and commanders, and she stood 7 feet tall with silver hair that glowed like starlight and skin that was pale like moonlight and eyes that saw more than human eyes could see. Ember was with her always, and he was a void dragon whose scales absorbed all light and made him look like a living shadow with eyes like burning gold, and he was young but already large enough to fill half the cargo bay of her small ship. They crashed in a place called Montana, and the landing was hard and violent, and it tore through trees and earth. Before the ship finally stopped in a valley between mountains, and Lyria thought they would be captured or killed by whatever lived on this world, but the humans found them and brought medicine instead of weapons, and food instead of chains, and shelter instead of prison. Selskati Morrison was the first human Lyria met properly, and she was a veterinarian who looked at Ember with wonder instead of fear, and she treated his wounds from the crash with gentle hands and kind words. Lyria could not understand this kindness at first, because in the Empire, when you crash on a world that is not yours, you become a prisoner, and the locals either serve you or die, and there is no middle ground between these two choices. But Katie just smiled and said they were safe here, and whatever they were running from had not found them yet. And Lyria wanted to tell her that she was not running from anything, but she stayed silent instead. The next 3 months, while her ship repaired itself slowly, Lyria watched humanity with growing confusion and something that felt like fear. They were warriors, yes, and she saw their military bases and their weapons, and their history was full of wars and conflicts and violence, but they were also something else entirely. They made art that served no purpose except beauty, and they protected creatures weaker than themselves, and they had laws against cruelty and systems to help their poor. And sick and old Katie treated Ember not as a weapon of war, but as a living being who deserved gentleness and care, and the dragon responded to this treatment by becoming calm and peaceful instead of angry and violent, like Imperial dragons always. War Commander Holly Jong came to speak with Lyria after 2 months, and her questions were direct but not hostile, and she sat across from the elf woman with dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Holly said that Lyria was military, and her ship had weapons that could destroy a city, so why had she not used them? Yet against the humans who found her, Lyria found herself telling the truth, and she said it was because the humans showed her mercy, and she was beginning to suspect that the Empire would not do the same thing for them if their positions were reversed. She was right about this, and the truth came faster than anyone expected. Valorian Task Force arrived on a Tuesday morning when the sun was just rising over the mountains, and 3 massive dreadnought ships hung in orbit above Earth like swords waiting to fall. High Admiral Sarath sent a message that was broadcast in every language that Earth possessed, and she gave humanity 24 hours to surrender. Lyria, Moon Whisper, and submit to Imperial authority as a vassal state under Valorian control. If they refused, then the Empire would destroy every major city on the planet and kill billions of humans as an example to other species who might think about defying Imperial. Lakati found Lyria in the barn where Ember had made his nest among the hay and equipment, and the elf woman was crying with tears running down her pale face. Lyria said she had brought this destruction upon them, and she should have died in the nebula instead of coming to Earth and bringing the Empire to their doorstep. Caddy put her hand on the elf woman's shoulder and said no very firmly, and she said that Lyria should have been met with kindness sooner, and maybe then the Empire would not be so eager to burn worlds for small reasons. In the command center deep beneath a mountain called Cheyenne, the military leaders of Earth gathered to make their choice, and Holly Jong stood before them with her jaw set in determination. She told them that the Empire thought humans were primitives who would surrender without a fight, because the Valorian ships were bigger and their weapons were stronger, but the Empire did not understand what they had done by threatening Earth's General Patricia. Hayes asked what that was, and Holly smiled, but it was cold like winter ice. She said the Empire had attacked their home, and they had taught Lyria what that meant to humans over the past 3 months. It meant war, and it meant that humanity would fight with everything they had, and they would not stop until either they won or they died trying. The message went out to every human on Earth within an hour, and people were told to prepare for battle area. Watched the preparations with Ember beside her and Katie cleaning her rifle with calm, efficient movements. Caddy, said that Lyria did not have to fight because this was not her war originally. But Lyria had been thinking about this for 3 months and watching humans teach her what kindness and mercy and home really meant. She looked at Katie and said she knew the Empire ships and every weakness they had and every blind spot in their defenses. She said that she and Ember were meant to be weapons for the Empire, but now they would be weapons against it instead. Katie nodded and handed Lyria a human-made rifle and said then they would fight together. Battle would begin at midnight, and Earth had no space navy, but they had missiles and nuclear weapons, and most importantly, they had humans who did not know how to give up. Lyria stood on the roof of the barn and looked up at the 3 Valorian dreadnoughts hanging in the sky above her adopted home. She had served the Empire for 200 years and never questioned its right to conquer and rule, but now she understood that some things were worth more than empires and orders and ancient traditions. Home, it's worth fighting for, and Earth had become her home. She whispered a prayer to gods she no longer believed in and asked them to forgive her for what she was about to do. Then she climbed onto Ember back and felt the dragon muscles tense beneath her as he prepared to fly. The void dragon roared, and it was a sound of defiance that echoed across the valley above them. The Empire waited confident in their superiority. Below them, humanity prepared to teach the galaxy a lesson about what happens when you attack someone home. The war was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same again for anyone involved. The Valorian Empire had perfected warfare over thousands of years, and their method was simple and brutal, and they used overwhelming force with perfect precision and left no room for anyone to negotiate or resist. High Admiral Sereth had personally conquered 47 different species during her long military career, and she expected humanity to be the 48th victory, and probably the easiest one yet. Her tactical officer reported that human technology was primitive and basic, and they only had conventional rockets and some nuclear weapons, but no shields or advanced defenses that could stop Imperial weapons. Sereth looked down at the blue planet below her command ship and studied it like a scientist might study an insect under glass. She asked where the traitor Moon Whisper was hiding, and her officer said she was still on the surface, and the humans claimed she was their guest and protected by their laws of sanctuary. The Admiral laughed at this, and the sound was like breaking glass, and she said sanctuary was a quaint idea, but meaningless against Imperial power. She ordered her ships to begin orbital bombardment of all military installations and said that when the humans begged for mercy, then they could discuss terms of surrender. The first beam of superheated plasma fire shot down from the dreadnought toward the mountains of Colorado, where the human command center was hidden deep underground. The beam never reached its target, and instead it scattered against something invisible that should not exist, according to all Imperial knowledge, and Technologicereth Bridge erupted into chaos and confusion as warning alarms started blaring throughout the massive ship. She demanded a report immediately, and her crew scrambled to understand what had happened. The sensors showed an unknown energy field covering the entire planet, and it had a power signature unlike anything in their extensive database of known technologies. And Earth, in a bunker built during the old nuclear war days. Dr. Lisa Grant watched her screens with satisfaction and relief. She announced to everyone in the command center that the Faraday network was holding strong, and every satellite and power grid and conductor they had was channeling energy into the defensive field. Holly Jong nodded, but her face remained serious and grim, because she knew this only bought them time and nothing more. She asked Lisa if they could actually hurt the Valorian ships with their weapons. Lisa shook her head and said not with anything they had in orbit, because the Imperial shields were real energy shields and not jury-rigged electrical fields like Earth was using for defense. Holly said then they needed to get through those shields somehow, and she turned to look at the tactical display showing 3 massive enemy ships hanging above their world like predators, she said, that Earth had been preparing for alien invasion since the Roswell incident in the 1940s, and now it was time to see if all those contingency plans were paranoid delusions or actually useful. Montana Lyria watched the same tactical displays with Ember. Massive head resting in her lap like a giant, deadly pet. Katie sat beside her, quietly cleaning and checking her rifle with practiced efficiency. Katie said that Lyria did not have to fight because this was not her war originally, and she could stay safe on the ground. Lyria laughed, but it was a bitter sound without humor, and she said that when the Empire threatens to destroy your home, it becomes your war, whether you want it or not. She looked at Katie and asked whose side she was on, and the question hung in the air between them. Lyria had been asking herself this same question for 3 months while living among humans and learning their ways. Now, as she watched the Empire prepare to slaughter the first species that had ever shown her real kindness, she finally knew her answer. She said quietly that she knew the Imperial ships inside and out, in every weakness and every blind spot in their design. She said that she and Ember were supposed to be weapons for the Empire, but they would be weapons against it instead. The counterattack began exactly at midnight when the moon was high. And Full Earth had no space navy with shields and energy weapons, but they had missiles, and they had thousands of them stored in silos. Across 6 continents, these missiles had been built during the Cold War, when humans feared destroying themselves. And now they would use them to defend against invaders from the stars. Holly Jong had learned something important from Lyria during their conversations, and that was that Valorian shields were designed to stop energy weapons like lasers and plasma, but not physical projectiles moving at high speed. The first wave of missiles launched from underground silos and rose into the sky on pillars of fire and smoke, and they numbered in the hundreds. The Valorian point defense systems were efficient and deadly, and they destroyed 90% of the missiles before they could reach the dreadnoughts. But the other 10% hit the shields like hammers, and the kinetic impact was something the shields were not designed to handle proper. Lyserith watched in shock and disbelief as her flagship shields began to flicker and fail under the assault of primitive chemical rockets. She screamed orders for evasive maneuvers and return fire, but the dreadnoughts were built for orbital bombardment and not for dogfighting with smaller, faster targets. The second wave of missiles launched, and this time something else came with them. From the wilderness of Montana, a shadow rose up into the night sky, and Ember had grown larger during his time on Earth because he was fed and cared for instead of starved and beaten. His void, dark scales drank in the starlight and made him almost invisible against the darkness, and Lyria rode on his back, wearing human flight gear instead of her Imperial armor. She held a human-made plasma rifle that Katie had given her, and she whispered words that felt like a prayer or a promise. She said this was for those who showed them mercy, and Ember roared his agreement, and the sound vibrated through space itself. Hit the nearest dreadnought like a living missile, and Ember claws tore through the hull plating like it was papylaria, fired her rifle into critical systems that she knew by heart from 2 centuries of service, and every shot caused explosions and failures deep inside the ship behind them. Human fighter jets scrambled from bases around the world, and their pilots were screaming defiance as they joined the attack. The Battle of Earth had truly begun, and the Valorian Empire was learning a terrible lesson that would echo through the galaxy. Humanity did not know how to surrender, and they did not know how to quit, and they would fight with everything they had until either they won or died trying. The first Valorian dreadnought began to die, and its reactor was breached by a combination of missile impacts and dragon claws. A massive ship started to fall from orbit and broke apart as it entered the atmosphere, and pieces of it burned like falling stars. 1,000 Imperial soldiers died in that ship, and their deaths marked the first time in 3,000 years that the Empire had lost a dreadnought in battle. Sereth watched her ship die and felt something she had not felt in centuries, and that feeling was fear. She ordered the remaining 2 dreadnoughts to pull back to high orbit and regroup because the primitives had surprised them. But Holly Jong was not done yet, and more missiles launched and more human fighters rose into the sky. Lyria and Ember attacked the second dreadnought with fury and precision born from intimate knowledge of every weakness. Elf woman fought against everything she had been taught and everyone she had served, and she did it without hesitation or regret, because Earth had shown her what a real home felt like, and she would die before she let the Empire take that away. The battle raged through the night and into the dawn, and when the sun finally rose, it found two Valorian dreadnoughts retreating, and one destroyed humanity had won the first round, but everyone knew the war was far from over. The first Valorian dreadnought died in flames over the Pacific Ocean, and its debris burned like falling stars across the sky, and it was beautiful and terrible at the same time. 8,000 Imperial soldiers perished in that explosion, and Holly Zhang allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel the weight of those deaths before she moved on to the next problem. She asked for status reports on the remaining dreadnoughts, and Lieutenant Amy Parker said they were pulling back to high orbit and regrouping, but their shields were damaged down to 40% strength. Holly said they had surprised the Empire, but that would not work twice, and the Valorians would adapt their tactics and bring their full technological superiority to Doctor. Lisa Grant looked exhausted and worried, and she said the planetary shield could only last maybe 18 more hours before they started causing blackouts across every major city on Earth. 18 hours was not enough time, and Holly knew it as she stared at the tactical display showing 2 massive enemy ships reorganizing beyond the Muna. Communication alert came through, and Lyria's face appeared on the screen, covered in soot and blood, with ember glowing eyes visible behind her in the darkness. Lyria reported that the flagship was damaged, but still functional, and Admiral Sarath would definitely call for reinforcements from other Imperial fleets. She said they had perhaps one day before more ships arrived, and then she did not need to finish the sentence because everyone understood what that meant. Holly said they were already done, unless Lyria had a better idea. The elf woman was quiet for a long moment, and her silver eyes reflected the starlight as she thought about their options. Finally, she said, there was one possibility, but it was desperate and dangerous, and probably would not work. Holly said they were already desperate, so she should explain her ideal area. Said the Empire had a protocol for when a species demonstrated sufficient military capability to be a real threat. In those rare cases, the species could request formal recognition and negotiate terms. Instead of facing complete subjugation and annihilation, Holly asked if Lyria thought the Empire would negotiate with them now. Lyria shook her head and said Admiral Sarath would refuse, because she was old guard and believed in absolute dominance without compromise. But if Earth could prove that conquering them would cost more than it was worth, then maybe the Empire would listen. She said they needed to make the Valorians believe that humans were not primitives to be crushed, but warriors who deserved respect. Holly asked how they could do that, and Ember, deep rumbling growl, provided the answer before Lyria spoke. They would take the fight directly to the enemy and board the flagship and capture Admiral Sarath herself. The plan was completely insane, but it was also their best and only chance. 6 hours later, a small team gathered in a secret hangar that had been built for classified aerospace projects. Captain Melissa Rivera led the Earth Special Operations Group, and she had 12 soldiers chosen for very specific skills. They had zero-gravity combat training from the space program in close quarters, fighting expertise from counterterrorism units, and the kind of reckless courage that made them volunteer for a suicide. Soon Katie Morrison was there too, with her rifle slung over her shoulder, and she ignored Holly protests about civilians. Katie said she was the only human that Ember trusted completely besides Lyria, and they needed the dragon for this mission, so they needed her. Teleria stood apart from the group, checking her Imperial armor. One last time it had been recovered from her crashed ship and repaired by human engineers, and she had sworn never to wear it again. Now putting it on felt like wearing a skin she had shed, and it was uncomfortable and familiar at the same time. Katie approached her and said quietly that Lyria did not have to do this, and she could stay safe on the ground. Lyria laughed, but there was no humor in it, and she said if this mission failed, then nowhere in the galaxy would be safe for her. The Empire did not forgive deserters and traitors, and they would hunt her forever. But more than that, she said, Katie and the other humans had shown her what a home should be. And it was a place worth fighting for, and worth dying for. She said she had never had that before in 200 years of service. To the Empire, Kati squeezed her hand and said, then they would make sure Earth stayed a home for all of them. The attack launched at dawn when the sun was just breaking over the horizon Earth. Remaining missiles fired in one massive coordinated barrage. And they drew the Valorian point defenses to the wrong side of the flagship in that brief moment of distraction. Ember streaked through the gap like a shadow against the stars. He carried 16 souls on his back, and they were betting everything on a plan that probably had only a 5% chance of success. They hit the docking bay hard. An Ember breath weapon cleared the area. Immediately, with superheated void plasma that he had been saving for exactly this moment, Imperial soldiers rushed to defend their ship, but they found themselves facing something they had never trained for. Lyria moved like flowing water in her combat skills. Merged with 3 months of human tactics and ingenuity, the Valorian troops expected a traitor and some primitives, but instead, they faced a coordinated strike team fighting with desperate fury. Melissa Squad roared battle cries as their weapons barked in the recycled air, and they shouted for Earth and for home. Illyria answered them and said, this was for the home they gave us. An Ember roar shook the bulkheads and made the lights flicker. They fought through 3 decks, leaving chaos and bodies behind them. Imperial soldiers had trained for orbital bombardment and ship-to-ship combat, but not close quarters fighting in their own corridors. Every junction was bought with blood, and every passage was a new battleground. Katie stayed with Ember and directed the dragon attacks with the same calm she used when treating injured animals. Back in Montana, the Void Dragon responded to her voice and trusted her judgment completely, and he became something the Empire had never imagined. Not a weapon of destruction, but a partner fighting alongside allies he cared about. They reached the bridge after 47 minutes of brutal fighting, and Katie had lost track of how many times they almost died. Admiral Sareth waited for them, standing before her command throne with a weapon in her hand and cold fury in her ancient eyes. She looked at Lyria and said one word that carried 3,000 years of Imperial contempt, and that word was traitor. She said Lyria had betrayed her own kind for these animals who barely understood fire. Lyria leveled her rifle at the Admiral's chest, and her hands were steady despite everything she said. She chose kindness over cruelty, and she chose hope over dominance. She said humans were not animals, and they were what the Altheri should have been. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats that felt like hours. Then Sarath smiled, and it was a terrible expression, without warmth or humor. She said capturing her would not end this, and the Empire was eternal and would last forever. She said if they killed her, then 10 more fleets would come, and if they spared her, then she would personally see Earth burn to ashes. Holly voice crackled over the communication channel, and she said the Admiral was wrong about something important. She said Earth was transmitting this entire conversation to every corner of the galaxy, on every frequency. Every species under Imperial rule was watching the mighty Admiral get beaten by primitives who did not even have faster-than-light travel. The Empire reputation was dying today, even if Earth died with its Surith expression crumbled as she understood the trap they had laid for Hertha. Empire power was built on the illusion of invincibility and superiority, and that illusion was shattering in real time across 100 worlds. Lyria stepped forward with her weapons steady, and she gave the Admiral to Choice's order, the ships to withdraw and recognize Earth's sovereignty, or become the Admiral who lost to a species that could barely reach their own minin. The terrible silence that followed the fate of Earth and the Empire hung in the balance. Admiral Sareth's fingers tightened on her weapon until her knuckles turned white beneath her translucent skin. Behind her, the bridge crew of the flagship watched in frozen horror as their commander faced down a traitor and the primitive aliens who had destroyed one of their dreadnoughts. Sarath spoke quietly,
Ow.
but her voice carried the weight of 3,000 years of Imperial history and dominance. She said they believed they had one, but destroying one ship and boarding another did not mean the galaxy would bow to their defiance. She said the Empire had broken species far more advanced than humanity could ever hope to become. Elisa Rivera team kept their weapons trained on the bridge crew, but Katie could see the tension in their shoulders and backs. They were the best soldiers Earth had, but they were still human and still mortal and still fighting an enemy that had conquered the stars. It was Ember who moved first, and the void dragon flowed forward like liquid shadow. He was massive and terrible, and his scales drank the light from the bridge displays until he looked like a hole in reality. Itself he positioned himself between Sereth and Lyria, and when he spoke, his voice resonated in the minds of everyone present. His thoughts carried images and memories that were not his own, but Lyria shared through their bond. He showed them what the Empire did to conquered species, and the slavery and genocide and worlds burned because they dared to dream of freedom. Sereth actually took a step backward, and her composure cracked because very few beings could communicate with void dragons. Even fewer had ever been addressed by one with such focused contempt. And Rajember continued and said, the Empire had never faced a species like humans before. They were young, yes, and primitive by Imperial standards, but they had something the ancient Empire had forgotten. Sereth demanded to know what that was, and her voice shook slightly. Ember said one word, and that word was Hopilaria. Lowered her weapon slightly and said humans looked at the impossible and saw only a challenge to overcome. She said the Empire came to conquer Earth, and the humans turned their entire civilization into a weapon in ours. She said they took a veterinarian and made her a dragon rider, and they took a loyal Imperial soldier and showed her what loyalty to something good actually meant on Earth. In bunkers and command centers across the planet, billions of people watched the confrontation play out on their screens. The Empire had meant to broadcast their conquest as a warning to other species, but humanity had hijacked the signal now. It was a declaration that even the smallest could stand against the mighty. Holly Jung stood in the Situation Room, watching multiple screens as reactions poured in from across the galaxy. Lieutenant Parker called out with her voice shaking between fear and excitement. Shit said they were receiving messages, and lots of them, and they were coming from everywhere. Holly told her to put them through, and the first message appeared came from a species called the Tyranni, who were 4 armed scholars conquered 2 centuries ago. Their message was simple and direct, and it said Earth had their support, and whatever weapons they had were now available. Then came the Kelthani, who were aquatic beings from a water-covered world. They said they could not fight, but they could hide human ships if Earth could reach them. More messages flooded in from species who had nothing to offer but moral support. Other species provided intelligence on Imperial fleet movements and locations of supply depots. Few whispered of hidden weapons and resistant cells that had waited generations for a sign that the Empire could bleed. Dr. Lisa Grant pulled up a galactic map and watched it transform in real time as pledges of support lit up across the darkness like stars being born. She whispered to Holly that they had just started a rebellion across the entire galaxy. Aboard the flagship, Sereth was seeing the same data on her displays. Her face had gone pale, and her ancient eyes were wide with recognition of something she had spent 3,000 years preventing. She said they had doomed themselves, and the Empire would never forgive. Thessaleria replied that the Empire was more fragile than it appeared. If one species standing up could threaten it, she said they were not asking for forgiveness, and they were demanding recognition as equals. Melissa Rivera stepped forward with her weapon trained on Sereth's head. She gave the Admiral 60 seconds to make a choice. As Seretha would order the remaining ships to withdraw beyond the moon orbit, she would transmit a message to the Empire stating that Earth was under formal negotiations for sovereign status. Or Melissa would put a bullet through her ancient skull, and they would negotiate with whoever was next in command. Sereth started to say they would not dare, but Melissa chambered around, and the sound was very loud in the sudden silence. Meal Essa said 50 seconds remain. Sereth looked around at her bridge crew but saw no help there. They were warriors, yes, but they were also practical, and the primitives had boarded their flagship pay trader. And void dragons stood against them, and the entire galaxy was watching their humiliation. Melissa said 40 seconds, and her finger rested on the trigger. Katie Morrison, who had spent her life healing animals and never fired a weapon in anger until today, raised her rifle. She said they were really not bluffing about defending their home. Said 30 seconds, and her voice was cold. And Flat Admiral Sereth, who was a veteran of 100 campaigns and conqueror of 47 worlds, looked into Melissa. Icy saw something that terrified her more than death, and that was someone who had absolutely nothing left to Lecesaroth said quietly to her crew to stand down and transmit the withdrawal order. The bridge erupted in protests, but the admiral raised her hand for silence. She told them to do it immediately, and that was a direct order from their commander as. The orders went out, the Valorian dreadnoughts began their slow retreat from Earth's orbits. Turned to Lyria with something almost like respect in her ancient eyes. She said they had won a battle and perhaps even a war, but the Empire was vast and had a very long memory. She said this would not end here, and there would be consequences. Lyria met her gaze without flinching and said no, it would not end here, but it began here, and that was enough for no one. Earth, as the sun rose over 100 cities that had been prepared for annihilation. Humanity watched their invaders retreat. The celebration was muted and cautious, because everyone knew this was just the beginning, but it was a beginning and a line drawn in the stars that said this far and no further. Holly Jong allowed herself a moment of exhaustion and leaned against the tactical display around her. The command center erupted in controlled celebration, and Relief General Patricia Hayes, who had served in 4 different wars, stood beside her. Holly asked quietly what they had done and what this would mean. Patricia smiled grimly and said they had given the galaxy hope. Now they had to figure out how to live up to it, and that might be harder than winning the battle in space above. Earth, the Valorian ships continued their retreats. Side the flagship, Admiral Sarath sat on her command throne and contemplated. The ruins of Imperial invincibility. Species without faster-than-light travel had defeated Hera Traitor, and a dragon had humbled the greatest military force in the galaxy, and worst of all, the entire galaxy had watched it happen. The Empire would never be the same again, neither would Earth. The war was over, but the real work was just beginning. 3 weeks after the Battle of Earth, the galaxy had transformed in ways that nobody could have predicted or imagined. The Valorian Empire, for the first time in 3,000 years of absolute rule, faced open rebellion on 17 different world species that had been conquered so long ago they forgot their own freedom now, rose up, inspired by humanity, defiance. The Empire response was brutal and swift, and they crushed some of the revolts with overwhelming force, but the damage to their reputation was permanent and irreparable. They could crush revolts with their military might, but they could not crush the idea that they were vulnerable and could be defeated. Lyria Moonwhisper stood on a balcony overlooking the newly built embassy complex in a city called Geneva. Member was coiled beside her like a living mountain, and the dragon had grown even larger in the weeks since the battle. His scales now held hints of color when light struck them just right, and there were deep purples and blues that Katie insisted were signs of health and happiness. Katie joined her on the balcony, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and she had been appointed as Earth official liaison to Lyrianathor. Of them had quite defined what that role meant, but they both understood it. They were friends and allies, and something more complex than either word could fully capture. Lyria said she was troubled and wondering if they had made things better or worse for the galaxy. She pointed out that 17 worlds were in open revolt, and thousands had died, and the Empire was wounded like a predator. Katie was quiet for a moment, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. She said her grandfather used to say that sometimes you could not avoid a fight. You could only choose whether to face it now or wait until it was at your doorstep. She said the Empire was always going to come for someone eventually better. That Earth stood up. When they did, then wait for the Empire to conquer other species first. Lyria said. Katie, grandfather sounded very wise. Katie smiled sadly and said, he was a Marine who fought in 3 wars, and he would have loved this. He would have loved the idea that they were fighting for more than just themselves. Below them, the embassy complex was busy with activity and movement. Representatives from the Turani and Kelthani and a dozen other species moved through the grounds. All of them were seeking the same thing, and that was alliance with the world that had bloodied. The Empire knows Earth had become almost overnight a symbol of resistance and hope for the oppressed admiral. Sarath was still on Earth, technically as a prisoner, but functionally as a negotiator. Empire had sent a diplomat named Ambassador Varan to discuss terms, and he had more flexibility than the rigid military commander in a conference room designed for different species. Environmental needs. Hollyjong sat across from Varan. General Hayes and Lyria flanked her on both sides. Varan said, The Empire was prepared to offer Earth protectorate status. They would maintain internal autonomy, but recognize imperial authority in all interstellar matters. In exchange, the Empire would provide technology and protection and access to galactic trade networks. Holly replied that, in other words, Earth would become their clients, and dependent on imperial goodwill. Arn said that was a rather cynical interpretation of a generous offer. Holly said it was an accurate interpretation based on historyleria. Leaned forward, and her silver eyes were hard as diamonds. She said she had spent 2 centuries enforcing exactly these protectorate arrangements for the Empire. They always began with promises of partnership, and always ended with subjugation and slavery. The Empire did not share power with anyone, and they only accumulated it. Varan gaze shifted to the elf woman, and he said she was hardly an unbiased observer. He said she had betrayed her oaths, and her people, and her entire civilization. For what exactly? For sentiment and misplaced loyalty to primitives who showed her kinness? Lyria said yes, simply and directly. She said she would do it again because humans showed her that strength without compassion was just brutality with better weapons. Ambassador was silent for a long moment, and then surprisingly he laughed. It was a dry sound, like sand shifting in desert wind. He said Lyria reminded him of someone he knew long ago. Before he learned to be practical, before he understood that idealism was a luxury the galaxy could not afford. Katie spoke up from her position near the door, and everyone turned to look at her. She said maybe that was the problem with the Empire. They had spent so long being practical that they forgot what they were supposed to be practical about. She asked what the point of a galactic civilization was, if all it did was enforce its own dominance. Varan answered with one word, and that word was stability. He said they provided order and prevented chaos across the galaxy. Hall challenged him and asked at what cost. She asked how many species the Empire had stabilized into extinction. How many cultures had they ordered into oblivion? The negotiations continued for 3 more days and went absolutely nowhere, though. Empire wanted submission dressed up as partnership. Earth wanted genuine sovereignty and freedom. The gap seemed completely unbridgeable. It was Ember who finally cut through the deadlock on the 3rd day. The Void Dragon had been quiet throughout the negotiations, just watching and listening. On the 3rd day, he suddenly rose to his full height, and his mental voice resonated through everyone's minds. He addressed Varen directly and said the ambassador negotiated as if the Empire held the strong position, but the Empire was burning, and 17 worlds were in revolt today. How many would revolt tomorrow and the day after that? Varen tried to maintain his composure, but there was real fear in his eyes. Void dragons were among the oldest species in the galaxy, and their words carried tremendous weight. Timber continued and said, Earth did not need imperial protection. They had proven they could defend themselves against the greatest military in the galaxy. What they needed, and what the galaxy needed, was an alternative to endless conquest. Earth offered that alternative, and it was a coalition of free worlds bound by mutual respect. Instead of fear, Varen repeated the word coalition slowly as he considered the implications. Holly said they were not proposing a rival to the Empire exactly. They were proposing a counterbalance, where the Empire could continue to exist and offer their version of order, but species should have a real choice between joining the Empire or joining the coalition. They could compete for loyalty instead of enforcing it through threats and violence. Varen said the Empire would never accept this arrangement. Amelia pulled up a holographic display showing the rebellion worlds. She said the Empire was already accepting it, whether they admitted it or not. The revolt worlds were not asking the Empire for better terms. They were asking Earth for alliance and protection. She said the Empire could fight them and spend the next century crushing revolts. They could watch their reputation crumble further with each battle lore. They could adapt and acknowledge that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. Varan was silent for a very long time, and his crystalline features reflected light from the hologram. Finally, he said, he could not make this decision alone. It had to go before the Imperial Council for debate and vote. Holly said, then he should take it to them. She said, with or without the Empire. Blessing the coalition of free worlds was forming right now. The Empire could help shape it, or they could be its enemy. She told him to choose wisely, too. Months later, the Galactic Accords were signed in a ceremony broadcast across the entire galaxy. The Empire did not collapse, and it did not formally acknowledge defeat. What it did was grudgingly accept a new reality that it could not change. Earth and its allies would be recognized as sovereign. Powers free to govern themselves, the Empire could still expand and recruit client states, but they could no longer simply conquer. Whoever they wanted it was not perfect, and the Empire remained powerful and dangerous. But it was a beginning of something new on Earth and the same. Montana Barn, where Ember first made his nest, Lyria and Katie watched the dragon fly overhead his void. Dark form was silhouetted against the sunset, and he was happy, and Freakity asked if Lyria ever regretted everything she had given up. The wolf woman had lost her rank and her people and her entire identity as an imperial officer. She was technically a traitor now and forbidden from ever returning to Valorian space, but she had gained something more valuable than any of that. She had a real home and genuine friends and a purpose beyond conquest. Lyria said no, and she had never regretted it even. Once above them, Ember roared, and the sound carried across the valley. It was not a war cry this time, but something softer and almost like joy. The Empire had been stunned when humanity declared, "You attacked our home," but the real shock that would echo through the centuries was what came after humanity fought back against impossible odds. And in fighting, they reminded the galaxy what was truly worth fighting for it. Territory or resources or dominance over others, but the simple radical idea that every being deserved to be free. 5 years later, the coalition of free worlds numbered 43 member species, had become its unofficial capital where former enemies met and negotiated. Lyria served as military advisor training defenders. In tactics that blended imperial precision with human creativity, Ember had found other void dragons enslaved by various empires, and together they formed the Coalition Rapid Response for Scotty and the Interspecies Medical Program Healing Wounds. Both physical and cultural. Holly Jung was elected as Earth representative to the Coalition Council. The Empire still existed and was still powerful, but no longer unchallenged some progressive members.